Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last of our global executive panels for this year, a partnership between the Victorian Local Governance Association and LGiU Australia. And we'll hear more about both those organisations in a moment. And I'll introduce our very esteemed panel for you shortly as well. But first, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of country from across Australia, indeed beyond, wherever you're joining us for this session this evening. We recognise the continuing connection of traditional owners to land, waters and community. I'm personally coming to you from the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Greetings from a very sunny, lovely Edinburgh this morning. A few words about the LGiU. We're a charitable organisation, a membership organisation for local authorities, providing primarily information services. We've got members, a lot of members in the UK and Ireland, but we've also recently started operating in Australia, where we have 20 members and about 40 or so currently on free trials or in the pipeline, including 4 or 5 from New Zealand as well. So we're picking up some interest there. Our partners in Australia are an organisation called SGS Environment and Planning, and they've helped to broker all sorts of relationships. One of the most valuable of which is the one we have with VLGA around these excellent events. We're bringing together senior management around all sorts of key issues that local authorities are interested in. I hope you have a great time during this event. If you're a member, welcome. If you're not a member, then please get in touch with me. Thank you.
So let's get into this evening's discussion. It's a very topical subject at the moment. In fact, I was reflecting the other day, I don't think there's a day goes by when we don't see some sort of an announcement or declaration from a local government somewhere about the housing crisis, whether it be about social and affordable housing or dealing with homelessness or other related issues. We'll hear from Peter Colacino in a while from Infrastructure Australia, who will confirm it was one of the number one issues that arose in their research when developing their latest plan. We are hoping to be joined by Kate Kennally. In fact, Kate, the CEO at Cornwall Council in the UK, was going to start proceedings this evening, but we think there's been some technical issues. So hopefully Kate will be able to join us and join in when she does. We have Brian Geaney with us, who I'd like to introduce to you now, who's the Assistant CEO of Cork City Council in Ireland. Welcome, Brian. We'll hear from you in just a moment, but I thought you might just like to say hello to the group.
Good evening and good morning to whatever part of the world that you're in. So look, it's just to thank Kathryn and Eddy and Andy for the invitation here. It's a lovely morning in Cork City, just after 8 a.m. over here. So obviously, I understand it's just after 6 p.m. in Australia itself. So look, again, delighted just to show maybe some of the examples and initiatives that we've been undertaking here in Cork City. But as Chris has said, massive issue here in Ireland as well after the financial crash in 2009, and in 7 or 8 years really of no construction, but really pent up demand now across the private, affordable and social housing sectors. So just to show what we as a council, some of our responses to that has been.
So Brian, we might get straight into your presentation. Just before we do, I just want to acknowledge and welcome Peter Colacino, who is from Infrastructure Australia. And Peter's going to be giving us a presentation and talking about the Infrastructure Australia approach to this housing issue in just a little while. So welcome, Peter, and we'll hear from you in just a little while. So Brian, let's kick off with your presentation. Looking forward to hearing about the Irish experience, and this concept of right-sizing, I think, is really interesting as well. So take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So just Cork City Council. I suppose the Cork City is the second largest city in the Republic of Ireland, with a population of just over 210,000 people, with an ambition through our national planning framework to 2040 to grow by 50%. So very substantial growth targets here for the second city, and I suppose as a counterbalance to Dublin, which would have a population of around 1.3 million people. So vastly different in size between a main capital city and the the second city here in Cork. So Cork City Council has a housing stock of just over now 10,500 units. So I suppose down through the years, around 50% of that stock. So it would have been sold through what's called a tenant purchase scheme. So I suppose all in all, in the history of Cork City Council, over 20,000 units have been provided in the history of the council. So I suppose historically it was very much construction of houses going through your normal tendering route on land that the council had acquired. But very much so, I suppose, in recent years, it's now more collaboration with the private sector and collaboration with approved housing bodies, which in effect in your own country and in the UK would be known as housing associations. So we work very closely with approved housing bodies in terms of delivery of our own programme to meet our own social housing need. The housing list in Cork City, I suppose, is just under 5,000 people, with around 3,000 actively engaging in what we call a choice-based letting system. So that's where the council puts a stock on a weekly basis that's available for letting up online, and a person expresses an interest, that's a qualified applicant, given their areas of choice in being allocated one of those units. And that initiative, which we brought in 2015, has greatly reduced our refusal rates. Our refusal rates before that could have been up to 40%. And that was purely on the basis it was matching the people to the stock that was available, and a very high refusal rate before. So that has greatly reduced that, and it's a really good system that's in operation, is now being rolled out to other local authorities here in Ireland. So basically, I suppose, again, traditionally, it was through our own architects, you know, that we would have been designing schemes, going out through normal public procurement route. And as I say, in a growing city and in a city with a scarcity of land, I suppose we've had to look at different ways in terms of meeting our social and affordable housing needs going forward. Just to add as well, I suppose, to become eligible for social housing, as a general rule, for a single person, you can't earn over €35,000, and you pay 15% of your net income then towards your weekly rent. So just to give an indication of how much people pay and how much people can earn to qualify for social housing. So, okay, what have we done? I suppose here in 2015, I suppose after the crash in 2009, Ireland went through a really difficult period. I suppose financially, you know, well documented now. We had to get assistance from the IMF. So really from a period of 2009, 2015, there was no real house building here in the country, and certainly no social housing construction. So just as an example of that, Cork City Council, given its size, constructed one unit in 2014. In 2019, it constructed just over 500 units. So I suppose that's the scale at what we had to build back up, I suppose, given the financial crisis that hit the country and hit the world or whatever at that time. So I suppose in 2016, I suppose my role at the time was program manager in housing delivery. So I suppose it was very much, we knew people and developers and landowners were out there. We knew that they wanted to deliver housing on land, but literally a lot of these were coming out of bankruptcy. They'd formed new companies. They had really been in pretty dire distress for a number of years. You know, they had gone through their own difficulties in terms of, as I said, the crash that had happened. So they were building equally back up. So I suppose we had to find a way of engaging with those developers and landowners and contractors that we knew wanted to get back in the business, but financially weren't able to do so. So I suppose we launched and I'll go into detail in this, what we call the competitive dialogue procurement process, that ultimately, I suppose, was you know, in a contract notice in the EU journal, inviting proposals and working right through the system with those developers, contractors and landowners, using the local authority's own planning, which we call Part 8, which is exempt from the normal planning process. So what happens there is a development is advertised for an 8-week period. Submissions are invited. Report is prepared that goes into our own council, and it's actually our own elected members. We have 31 here in Cork City that they vote on the project, and whether the project proceeds or not is by simple majority. So we've never had a Part 8 since then fail. So we work really here closely with our own council in terms of making these projects happen. So just on to, and I'll go through a bit more in detail how that process works. So something that came out of just on the right sizing, then basically this is an initiative that came out of the competitive dialogue process. So right sizing, in effect, it facilitates downsizing. Historically, it was called, we'll say, older persons that are aged 60 or over. They're living in a house maybe that's just too large for their own needs. So again, even in our own housing stock, there's roughly in our 10,500 units, 10% of those are under occupied. That's where you have maybe, again, an older person on their own or with their husband, wife or partner that, are living in a 3 or 4 bedroom property. So I suppose we wanted to come up with an initiative that would encourage them, as I say, to right size. So out of the competitive dialogue process, I suppose, in areas where, we were able to get sites in areas where ordinarily social housing was never delivered in the past. And we completed a project at Orisvera, which is in the Blackrock area, which has won now an Irish Council of Social Housing Award and an award from Chambers Ireland, just in terms of the innovation behind it, where we built the scheme. It came through the competitive dialogue. 20 residents gave up their local authority homes and moved into the accommodation. And then there was a further 10 that sold their properties to Cork City Council at a discounted rate. So we have the downsizing scheme approved by our own council. So in effect, if you're aged between 60 and 70, you get 2/3 of the price of your home. And I suppose the older you are, the more money you get for your property on the basis that the lifetime of the tenancy will be shorter. So it's an initiative that's has worked really well at Orisvera, and such is the case that we're currently constructing another scheme of 35 units in Blackrock, another 24 units in Bishopstown, and another 25 units at South Douglas Road. And as I say, many of these areas would be areas where historically we haven't delivered social housing at these locations because the council wouldn't have had the land at these locations in the past. So again, I suppose the accommodation is designed with regard to lifetime home standards to accommodate residents and visitors, with varying levels of mobility. So I think that was really important at the start and was really an important factor with our own councillors as we worked through the Part 8 process with them. Tenant involvement, in terms of setting up a residents association in the complex, that's working very well. And what we have done in the scheme at Orisvera, we've actually brought in an approved housing body to manage the scheme on the council's behalf. So this is something that we're looking to do very much again in the future. And as I say, that's why we've rolled out the projects that we have and more projects in the future. But there's been a really positive and sustained public reaction, so much so that people in the area when the complex was built, and social housing should look like any other housing. It shouldn't be different to housing that's been built by the private sector. But certainly the view locally was that, this didn't look like social housing. and much of what we're doing now doesn't look typically like social housing looked at in the past. So a great example and working very well to date. So just again, our competitive dialogue, just in terms of the different stages that it goes through. I suppose the first year we launched the dialogue through an EU notice. Basically, you know, we probably had maybe 9 or 10 projects that came forward, all proceeded to Part 8, and in effect we delivered probably a couple of hundred units. Then the next iteration of that competitive dialogue 2, again, much more developers came forward, and there was maybe 600 or 700 units delivered. And we're currently in a process at the moment where there's over a couple of thousand, over 2,000 units that are currently in the pipeline. So I suppose what that has demonstrated to us, that people in the sector here in the city have looked at this process and said, you know, absolutely, I want to get involved with the council. I want to get involved with the use of the Part 8 process where the councillors vote. And that is always something that's risky, you know, some projects can, you know, invite up to over 1,000 submissions from the public, much of which might be against a particular project. But changes are made with our council just to try and you know, calm the fears locally in terms of what's being proposed. So ordinarily, a lot of projects, as I say, are altered through the Part 8 process. But I suppose there's a real bonus then for the developers themselves, in that the land is bought up front by the council, and a project agreement is signed on the same day at a fixed price. I think that's really important for us, especially as costs have moved. You know, over the last number of months. You know, again, it's a worldwide phenomenon where steel, timber prices have vastly increased. But I suppose it's a real plus for us that we've gone into these fixed price contracts, and so much so that, you know, our own purse strings, I suppose, are held very much centrally by the Department of Housing, which is based in Dublin. So I suppose we apply to that department for each individual projects, and our allocation is made on that basis. But I suppose as final accounts are going back in, they're all going back in now with a zero additional costs, which is very, very different from what that department would have been used to from councils in the country that would have procured projects through the traditional means. Also, I suppose each project, what we call a stakeholder engagement plan, is prepared. So I suppose that stakeholder engagement plan, you know, we take the consultation doesn't stop after the planning process. The consultation process absolutely happens right through that construction process. So, you know, the local community are on board with that, local councillors are on board, and I suppose, you know, that's purely about keeping residents informed, consulting with them on all aspects of the project, and it's something that's working really well. And I suppose a really positive, you know, unintended consequence of all this is that while ultimately our strategy was we had to, you know, get out in the market to meet our social housing need. But what has actually happened now is here in the city is that it has led to the regeneration of parts of the city that ultimately where no housing development had taken place in a number of years. So that has been a real added bonus to the developments that have happened, in particular in the city centre. So really positive outcomes in terms of dereliction and derelict sites that have been removed in the city through many of these projects. So again, I suppose how the process works, as it says, the notice goes up, and then, you know, there's a diagram there, I suppose, with the various iterations and stages that this goes through. Projects are divided up into lots, depending on the size of the projects. They go through different stages in terms of, you know, the design solution, you know, the financial cost of providing the units, and our own architects department here and planning department work right through with the promoters of the projects in the various stages to get them to planning stage. You know, Part 8 goes to council, is advertised, goes to council, and if approved, then it goes to what we call tender, and the projects are ranked. But I suppose every project that we put through the system to date has been funded. And I suppose our own Irish Council of Social Housing just this year, it won the initiative won the overall award for a housing initiative in Ireland for 2021. So much so, I suppose, that Dublin City now, which would be our biggest city, as you said earlier, Dublin City Council have started to roll out this process. Such is, I suppose, the success of it to date. Like what can go wrong, you know, at times, you know, it's like everything. I suppose just it's really important, I suppose, in terms of the stakeholder engagement. We've invested an awful lot of time in that. So I think if anybody is setting out in this strategy, I think it's really important that local communities are kept on board. You know, your own council is kept on board, because this isn't going to happen otherwise. Because I think if there is one project, you know, that's poorly managed, or, you know, isn't built in accordance with what we all set out to achieve first day, I think the confidence in the system could wane. But to date, we're very pleased or whatever with the outcomes that it has delivered. So it's just, I suppose, in terms of another initiative that has been launched recently by our own government is a policy document called Housing for All, which we draw our funding from. So there's a commitment there over the next 5 years to spend 20 billion in Ireland on housing. So that's 4 billion a year in the provision of social and affordable housing. But I suppose an initiative that we had not seen before in Ireland is what's called cost rental. And many of you would probably be aware of, we'll say, what's called the Vienna model as well. So Ireland is trying to move into that space going forward. But this is, I suppose, an initiative where approved housing bodies will be grant aided up to 30%. They'll borrow 70% of the cost of a project, and the market rents have to be at least 25% under market value. It's a real issue here in Ireland, in particular in the urban areas, with rents here in the city, you know, attract like 2-bedroom apartments, attracting rents of up to €2,000 per month. So that's a real problem for our young population in terms of trying to afford that, and also our student population in trying to afford those rents, and what worse again in Dublin. So I suppose this is an initiative, you know, what might be for those that aren't eligible for social housing, you know, those that we maybe refer to as the squeeze middle. And we've started construction of a project at Lancaster Quay here, which is in the city centre near the university, where rents will be roughly around 40% under market value. So there's 88 apartments, 73 of which are affordable rental, 15 social, that are currently under construction to be completed in August of next year. So as and coming through the competitive dialogue, you know, we hope to roll out hundreds of these units in the city over the next 15 or 16 months, just to deal with that substantial pent-up demand that's there, in particular from those employed in the service industry and that might not be eligible for for social housing.
Perhaps you might like to just have a short break there. I think we've got a couple of questions about some of what you've said. I'm conscious we've got a couple of other speakers, but Kathryn, there's one in particular, I think, around the level of responsibility that the councils have there in Ireland, isn't there?
There is indeed. And can I just make a comment in listening to Brian's presentation? There were certainly some similarities in the policies that you've described, as we've found in a Victorian policy that's recently been released by the state government, which is called the Big Housing Build, and in particular around the principle of social housing looking and feeling like any other residents in the area. Before I get to the difference, which we might actually talk about at the end, because there are some differences in council responsibilities across the jurisdictions, i.e. in the Republic of Ireland and the UK, councils do have at times significantly more responsibilities than councils in Victoria have, and they have a central government as opposed to the state government. But Wayne Sproul had a question, and he was asking Brian what percentage of homes would be that in the Shire in regard to the 1,000 homes, Brian, that you referred to. So what's the percentage of that? Of homes would that be in the Shire?
10,000, I think.
10,000, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you'd be looking at, I suppose, maybe 10-12% of the total stock in the city would be social housing. We went through a major boundary extension in 2019. So basically the percentage would have been higher up to that area. So this is where there was a boundary extension here in the city, and areas that were in the functional area of Cork County Council, which is another local authority here that caters for the functional area in the county. We would have taken a land transfer, which obviously included then a number of private housing units and over 1,000 social housing units. So it would have been higher previously to that, but around 12% down to total stock would be social housing.
Peter Colacino, the Chief of Policy and Research at Infrastructure Australia, is going to talk to us a bit about what Infrastructure Australia has been observing in relation to the housing issues and how that presents in their latest plan. Peter, good evening.
Thanks so much, Chris, and hello, everybody. Thanks so much for that presentation so far, Brian. I'm going to share my screen as well and share a bit of a presentation. And it's going to be what I would say just a slightly different pace or level of detail as to some of what Brian's just touched on. I'm going to really talk about some of the macro issues affecting the sector. Apologies there, just trying to get the full presentation mode up. So for those that don't know Infrastructure Australia, we were created in 2008. Our role is to advise governments at all levels. So we are part of the federal government, but our role is very much to advise state and territories and local governments as well. We also have a role advising industry and community around both investments and reforms in the infrastructure sector. I'm pleased to say that IA is the first of this type of organisation anywhere in the world, but we're now amongst many kindred spirits, including the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK. We are also twins or siblings, if you like, to the Scottish Futures Trust. I'm very pleased to say that in Ireland, there's recently been a commitment to form a similar body. So bringing Ireland into a group, including Canada, Russia, Saudi Arabia, New Zealand, the UK and Australia, with these independent infrastructure bodies whose role it is to help governments fulfill their policy objectives, but to do so by providing independent advice. We are very lucky at Infrastructure Australia that a couple of years ago now, in fact 4 years ago, our then Minister Paul Fletcher, now back in the urban infrastructure portfolio, asked IA to bring social infrastructure as an infrastructure class into our work program alongside economic infrastructure. And at that time, we brought social housing as a subsector into our gaze. And our real focus over the intervening period, is to understand the role of social housing and indeed affordable housing within both the social infrastructure sector and separately its role, or related but separately, its role within the urban form, within places. And both of those areas, social infrastructure and place, are major focuses of the 2021 Australian Infrastructure Plan, as Chris mentioned, that we released around a month ago. Sorry, apologies for falling over my words. In bringing social housing into the document, what we've really sought to do is put social infrastructure and indeed social housing itself on the same pegging as economic infrastructure. That means we want to help inform decision-making to ensure where economic benefits are created from that infrastructure. They're measured alongside the economic benefits of, for instance, roads or energy or water or indeed telco. We also brought waste, another local government asset class, into the Australian Infrastructure Plan. So I'd commend to all of you having a look at the plan at its very lightweight reading, 648 pages. But indeed, we have a number of other documents that are much more consumable. And what we have done through the document is to contextualize social housing as an industry, but also to dive into social housing through our social infrastructure analysis. So the role of the document, or the way the document's presented, sees social infrastructure as a whole, but considers subsectors, for instance, housing, in both our recommendations and also in the discussion. What you can see here is our first recommendation. It looks to the role of social infrastructure in supporting quality of life. So this is really the core service benefits associated with social infrastructure. And our discussion really talks to the changing role in the context of COVID. So for many classes, social housing, obviously a key exception, there has been a shift to digital service delivery, a move away from physical assets to digital assets, but also a focus on choice. And I'd really emphasize that issue around choice and fit for purpose of assets in the context of social housing. You know, we see all of us, myself included, and I'm sure many of you in Victoria, or if not all of you, in fact, in your home right now, working. So the role of these assets has shifted. And what we see is, for tenants of social housing, what might have been pre-existing issues associated with whether the asset was fit for purpose, whether it has adequate space for work and indeed rest, the location of the asset with regard to social services, all being compounded by the impacts of the pandemic. We also see, really pointedly, a shortfall of assets in the social housing space, most critically in Victoria. So Victoria is the jurisdiction in Australia with the greatest shortfall of the provision of social and affordable housing, an asset class that is typically provided by the state and territory government, although of course there are funding agreements supported by the federal government. And I give that reflection not to be political, and I just emphasize the point, we are an independent body. That is a widely regarded understanding of the state of social housing in Victoria. So what that means as a result is that we do need to see a focus on implementing our recommendations. They are recommendations that touch on different levels of government, although the specific change agents, the reform owners and supporters, are identified in the plan. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see our social infrastructure and affordable housing recommendation, which really points on expanding the pipeline of projects, looking to funding over the medium and long term. So this is a growing challenge in Australia, a challenge that's expected to grow. We expect to see ourselves 675,000 properties short sometime in the next 15 years. And as I say, the current shortfall in Victoria is most pronounced. We also want to see a focus on the quality of assets, as I mentioned, making sure they're fit for purpose, well located. And that issue of location is a really pertinent one for local government. We also want to see a focus on particularly Indigenous housing in remote Australia, perhaps not an issue as prominent for Victoria. And finally, we want to see a really clear role for community housing providers, of which local governments already are. Many local governments are already filling the role of community housing providers, making them eligible for funding from other levels of government, albeit, of course, there is a risk of cost shifting that needs to be managed. The next area is around partnerships, and this is really focused on precinct planning. Our precinct recommendations are actually focused more on health and education than they are on housing. But I would make the point that one of the specific recommendations around updating the PPP guidelines really is particularly relevant for social housing, because it talks to the value of alternate financing mechanisms, something that lends itself very much to social housing. PPPs and indeed alternate private delivery models, such as those pursued by the CHIPs, the community housing providers, are proven. They are very well established domestically and also globally, and they are the type of model that lends itself to alternate financing delivery by local government. So local government should participate in the market of both delivery and considering whether there's a role as a client in delivering social and affordable housing. Finally, this point around the role of social infrastructure as economic infrastructure, we have really made an attempt to draw out. So we see the huge economic contribution of social infrastructure assets. Housing, of course, green and blue infrastructure, a clear role for local government, also extending across health and education with the role enabling the workforce. However, those benefits are particularly and notoriously difficult to quantify. There's a body of work in different jurisdictions to explore these issues, as well as a process led by something called the Housing Consortium, in part from UNSW, but also community housing, the Community Housing Industry Association looking at this issue. So we see a role in better understanding the value of community housing, social housing, in terms of property values, in terms of outcomes for tenants. But really, the role for local government is thinking about the contextual offering for those houses and understanding the quality of the asset and contributing to the urban fabric, and also contributing to the economic value, the land value of neighbouring properties. I'll just touch on two other issues quickly. The first of those is solving for place. And I really just want to emphasise the critical role we see for medium density housing within the context of our fastest growing cities. And let's not forget, Melbourne is the fastest growing city in Australia, certainly at that large urban agglomeration scale. We see a really clear role for medium density in supporting good housing outcomes, promoting choice and indeed housing affordability and entry for a variety of different tenants. And we see a role for the explicit consideration of the provision of affordable and also social housing within large-scale, medium-density developments. We also see a really clear role, as played out through the social infrastructure chapter, but also in our place theme looking at fast-growing cities, for thinking about the location of these assets with regards to other infrastructure such as transport, but also high-quality access to digital connectivity, both of those components obviously being critical for participating in the workforce. And then just one final area, an area of huge innovation. And I love to point to this picture on the right here. This is something called the Illawarra Flame House, developed by students at the University of Wollongong, my hometown. And this is a conversion of a fibro 2-bedroom social housing property to a sustainability positive property that both limits its draw in terms of electricity and water through efficient urban design, but also some sustainability initiatives associated with growing food on site and some areas that perhaps push outside the bounds of local government. But it just shows you what is possible around innovation with these properties, and that we don't need to see social housing as a box or as a 1950s style red brick apartment building, but in fact, these assets have diversity. And as we're able to deliver in areas like, for instance, improved energy efficiency, we not only deliver for the tenants in terms of an improved livability and housing experience, but also reduce pressure on their income support. So I would really point to the role of local government in the context of planning around medium density, and also considering some of these other provisions around the provision of affordable and social housing within their LGAs. Chris, on that note, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. You've given us a lot to think about there, and I'm sure there'll be some follow-up questions after we hear from our last speaker. So Kate Kennally is with us. If I can ask Kate to, there she is, to turn her camera on. Kate is the CEO of Cornwall Council in the UK and is going to talk to us about the leadership role that they're playing in their part of the world, particularly in relation to homelessness. Kate, thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you, and Gwrthitha da. Good evening in Cornish. I'm Kate Kennally, and I'm the Chief Executive of Cornwall Council, and thanks so much for the invitation to join this global panel discussion on the housing crisis. So, by way of background, Cornwall Council, it's a large unitary council in the UK, so a top-tier local authority. We don't have state government within England. So we have responsibility for housing, for social care, child protection services, transport, economic development. So we were created in 2009, serving a population of 560,000, matured over the last 12 years to the extent that we hosted the global G7 summit in June. And those spectacular picture postcard images of the G7 summit beamed across the world, and it was great to welcome your Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to Cornwall. They did mask the fact that Cornwall is a place of stark contrasts, which have become more pronounced as a result of the pandemic. And I think one of the areas that dominates the scale of the challenge and the widening gap in social mobility is the access to decent, affordable living accommodation, to the extent that we are describing ourselves as being in a housing crisis. Now, this housing crisis is limited to Cornwall, I think across the world. In the developed world, we're seeing the pandemic leading to rising housing prices. So I think this discussion's welcomed in the context of actually what we're all experiencing at the moment. But I've been asked to share a little bit about our journey since 2017, and I'll finish with where we are today. So 2017, we had elections, and that's always a point to reaffirm what the priorities are for the place. And our members were really clear that homes for Cornwall needed to sit at the top of the shop. If we think about our own lives, what enables us to do the roles that we do to support our families is the security of a roof over our heads. And we call it homes rather than houses, because a home is a place in which that you are secure and which that you can thrive socially, emotionally, and economically. And we agreed 5 priorities under the Homes for Cornwall initiative. We recognise that as a local authority, we had a role to play in directly delivering and building homes, not just in social and affordable, but actually in parts of the market where the market wasn't delivering the quality of product that we wanted to see. We wanted to raise the standards of private rented homes. We wanted to support the community, bring forward homes in their communities which met their needs, unlocking small sites, working with community land trusts to deliver affordable homes in local communities, bring back empty properties into use, and reduce the number of people who have to spend more than 10% of their income to heat their homes. Because after rents or mortgages, fuel costs are the second biggest expenditure. And then there were a set of measures that sat behind those, and they were mission central to us as an organisation. And thinking about then what we did, a range of different interventions, some at a community scale, some at a Cornwall level, and some working across with government. And I think that that's at the heart of what local government is about facilitating and brokering those arrangements. So hearing from the Australia infrastructure lead there, that challenge being given around local government working with those national bodies to provide the leverage and the facilitation of local projects. So some examples of those things in Cornwall. Well, we invested £205 million through borrowing on the council's balance sheet to intervene in the private rented market by bringing forward a new product that offered long-term security of tenure that was superly energy efficient. So we made a calculation that actually people could afford a market rent if actually fuel costs were a lot lower. And that now forms part of our investment portfolio, generating a return that we're using to support other parts of the council services. But we've also invested £200 million into social housing. We've worked with community housing groups to renovate stock that's sitting in their local community and bring that back into use, targeted and protected for meeting local housing needs. We continue to deliver a grant programme to our registered social landlords. I think they must be your equivalent of your community housing providers, where the local authority is directly providing funds for them to deliver affordable housing on our behalf. We've acted as a master developer to bring forward stalled sites. We've invested, for example, £150 million into a strategic site to put in place the infrastructure that will unlock 3,000 homes that a private sector developer couldn't get away without upfront local government investment. And we've worked across with government in terms of a national private rented energy efficiency pilot, national housing retrofit pilots as part of the UK's move to net carbon zero. And specifically, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing on homelessness, we've bought back 380 long-term unoccupied homes, and we've had a strong focus on homelessness prevention. Now, I'm sure all of us agree that it is just simply unacceptable in developed countries that anyone should be without a home at all and need to sleep rough. And the attendant risks and dangers that that brings have been brought into sharper focus during the pandemic. And we are absolutely determined that no one should sleep rough in Cornwall, but they do. And in 2016, Cornwall was among those authorities with one of the highest levels of rough sleeping outside of London. Mild climate, end of the line, metaphorically and physically, Cornwall has found itself as a place for rough sleeping. And at the annual count, there were 99 people found to be sleeping out. So we needed to do something about it. We developed a plan focused on prevention, but then also on emergency accommodation and supporting those to move on to settled accommodation and avoid them being at risk of returning to the streets. Now, that multi-agency partnership consisting of outreach support, mobile assessment hubs, investment in accommodation meant that we did reduce our rough sleeping by 70% compared with 2016 in 2019 and 2020. But then the pandemic struck. And whilst we thought we'd done really well, actually the government's programme to get everyone in revealed that we had around 400 single people that were hidden homeless, that were sofa surfing, that actually then presented to us in housing need. We had to step up. So we repurposed social housing vacancies as temporary accommodation. We provided furnishings to provide and enable immediate occupation so that people could self-isolate. We moved heaven and earth to secure appropriate move-on accommodation, particularly for households that in the short term we could use hotels and holiday parks because they weren't in use, but we then needed places for them to go, and we've brought forward 70 longer-term housing units for single homeless people to avoid a return to rough sleeping. We've been adamant that coming out of the pandemic, we want to make sure that we use this moment to address the core challenges that the last 19 months have only served to amplify. So with our new council following elections this year, we've agreed a new 2050 vision, which is based on achieving 6 transitions, one of which is thriving places with decent homes, so that by 2050, street homelessness in Cornwall is ended and every child has a secure home to grow up in. Vibrant towns and villages are well connected, so people can easily access what they need to live, work and play, with twice as many journeys made by green and active travel. And I know you will have your own versions of it, but I think when times are challenging, we've all got to have a really clear, well, I'll say North Star, you'll probably say South Star, that kind of guides and shapes where you need to be going. And for me, it was central that housing was back up there as being number one with our new administration. So what are we now doing today in delivering against that 2050? Well, we are wanting to keep a roof over the heads of those 400 people that revealed themselves as being hidden homeless during the pandemic. We're working with around a further 5,500 individuals and families in Cornwall to help them avoid being homeless through a homelessness prevention service, bringing together our welfare support services, our welfare services, looking at those root causes and providing financial assistance and intervening with landlords to try and keep people in their homes. We've accelerated and stretched our targets around empty homes being brought back into use, and through the planning process and what we are doing in terms of housing development, accelerating the number of affordable homes that we're making available. We're providing over 5,000 discretionary crisis grant payments and awards to Cornwall who are struggling to pay for food and other bills, totaling around £1.8 million worth of support. And we are funding our welfare advice services to help an estimated 5,000 people to get relief from unmanageable debts. But despite this, it is evident that circumstances beyond our control are creating this perfect storm. And such is the extent of that crisis that we need to go further, even beyond that. So working towards ending homelessness and rough sleeping will see us take actions which include working with the UK government to achieve a further devolution of powers from London to Cornwall. This includes changes to the planning laws to stop residential properties converting to Airbnb without a change of use category, because we are seeing so many private landlords see a short-term opportunity to achieve a holiday rent of over £1,000 a week compared to making the home available for a local family, which would generate a rent of around £800 a month. And that's a real issue for us, particularly with staycations as a result of the pandemic. We want as well to stop the proliferation of second and holiday homes continuing. So we are also wanting further to embed changes in the planning process, which actually limits the extent to which that new builds can be acquired for second home purposes. We want to bring about a step change in the supply of affordable housing, and that's why we're considering purchasing private houses and making them affordable dwellings through the use of our balance sheet. We're also attempting to speed up the supply of housing through a range of initiatives, including a Cornwall-based housing partnership with government's Home England agency to get stalled ex-mining sites moving. By no means have we got a monopoly on good ideas to address the housing crisis, which is why events like this are so useful in hearing about initiatives from other parts of the world. Thanks, Chris, for giving us the opportunity to share our Homes for Cornwall journey. More than happy to take any questions. I have got some slides to illustrate these points, which I'll be very happy to send over. So it's got some of the detail if colleagues would find that useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was fabulous. You might not have a monopoly on good ideas, but you've certainly got some good ideas in there. I saw people feverishly taking notes, so we will share those slides. So it is Q&A time. Please use the chat to make sure there's questions. We've got time for probably 3 or 4. And Kathryn, I'll throw to you to see if we've got any to start the cross-panel discussion.
Yeah, look, thank you, Chris. There are a few coming in now, just as Kate's finished. And wow, Kate, what a bold and courageous journey your council is embarking on to address this very real issue. Thank you for that presentation. Before I go to some of the questions, I just wondered whether Peter might explain, particularly for the Victorian members of the audience, how the work of Infrastructure Australia connects in, particularly the release of your 15-year strategy with the 30-year strategy that Infrastructure Victoria recently released, and particularly as it relates to the housing issue.
Yeah, really great question. The answer is slightly complex in the sense that Infrastructure Australia, as the first of these bodies, was created before IVIC. And in both of our respective acts, we have obligations around the development of our plans. That means in a formal sense, there's not clear connection between the two. But in a much more practical sense, I work very closely with Michelle Masson, who's actually finishing up at IVIC. Fortunately, a gentleman I've worked with previously, and hats off to Michelle for the role that he's done at IVIC, but also Jonathan Spear, who'll be acting in that role. And with both Michelle and Jonathan, we've been through a long process of sharing, both in terms of the direction and strategy in our documents, as well as sharing best practice. And I'd just point to perhaps not that social housing example from Victoria, but a resilience example, another very relevant issue for local government from New South Wales, where we partnered with Infrastructure New South Wales to actually develop a shared approach that is adopted in their state infrastructure strategy and our plan. So looking at the Victorian plan and the IVIC plan, I should say, and the Infrastructure Australia plan, you should see them both as joined up, a shared reflection from inside government, but separate to political processes about the action that's needed. And in a housing sense, we both see the critical need. We both see the shortfall in Victoria. We see an expanded role for alternate and innovative financing. And very particularly, we see the interconnection between social housing and other infrastructure classes at a place level. So hopefully in reading both documents, you'll see a strong level of alignment, Kathryn.
Thanks for that. That's been really useful. Now we have a few questions again for you, Peter, one from the Surf Coast, asking whether IA, Infrastructure Australia, has considered the role of the tax system, particularly negative gearing, as a factor behind the increasing unaffordability of housing to buy or to rent.
Yeah, really great question and a complex question. So let me start at a higher level in terms of the tax system. So we do consider the tax system in our policy advice. Stamp duty and land tax, as well as negative gearing and other considerations, all need to be put into the mix in considering our housing market. I'd just say, as a headline for IA, we're not as interested in private housing as we are in social and affordable housing. Ultimately, we're Infrastructure Australia rather than, housing or Tax Australia or another version of that. But it means that we tend to look through a smaller lens. But I would say, really particularly, there is a role for, and this is perhaps a contrary view to that view from Cornwall, there's a very clear view for multiple home ownership. It's that second home that's a home that's available for rent, either for a long-term tenant, perhaps under a supported model like affordable housing, or perhaps to somebody paying through the commercial rental system but receiving rent assistance. It could be another form of benefit like the family tax benefit that's supporting their income, but often those benefits that sit outside of the tax system and live in the transfer system are somewhat hidden from homeowners. So I'd just say there is absolutely a role for the rental system. There is a role, obviously, for home ownership as well. And the build to rent asset class is an area that's growing in relevance in Australia. One that I heard that Kate mentioned is a focus elsewhere, not in Australia. I would just say, as a final thing, in terms of the tax system more broadly, and perhaps I would roll levies into this system, it is local government, not state and territory government, and certainly not the federal government, with all of the levers in your hand to capture the value from property development in your LGAs. It is all of you on this call who have those levers, who can use developer levies, who can use more sophisticated models in order to create revenue streams that you can use to underwrite asset provision, and indeed, in a broader sense, whole of life costs within your LGAs. So I really encourage you to bring a sharp mind to that. And it's not just the view of IA, but indeed it's the view right back to the Henry Tax Review. It's a view prosecuted by the Productivity Commission. It's a view prosecuted by the New South Wales Productivity Commission. And indeed, it's part of an ongoing focus around paying for housing in Queensland. So really, it's all of you on this call who have your hand, who hold that lever.
Thanks for that, Peter. We might go back over to the Republic of Ireland now, and we've got a question here from Apollo Bay, actually. How are privately held properties in Cork acquired, and how is the value established? So one for you, Brian.
So I suppose there's an independent market valuation carried out by a valuer that's part of the institute here in Ireland, that's independent both from the council and the seller. So we've reached values easily enough on that basis. So what happens then, once the value is agreed, the council can pay up to that value, and then you have your normal conveyancing process after that, but certainly is a very streamlined process over here.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. Kathryn, if I might jump in, I was keen to ask this question as well, and I noticed it's popped up in the chat, and it's possibly for you, Kate, or anyone else who can provide some perspective. This issue of the Airbnbs, tying up properties. I know, for example, Hobart very recently is doing some work around its planning scheme to put some limits around that. What sorts of things have you tried? What have you heard might be tried to help mitigate that issue?
So within the UK, we have devolution to Scotland and to Wales and to Northern Ireland. And the Scottish Government actually have introduced legislation which enables local authorities to designate through the planning process areas as control areas and issue a control order, which means that if actually an owner is seeking to change the designation of a home from residential to it being used for holiday lets, that has to be managed through the planning process. So we in Cornwall, being part of the England part of local government, would like that same ability to do that as exists in Scotland. Airbnb offer wanting to register, in part that's useful, but for us it's more around actually what is happening in particular communities, some of our coastal communities, where actually people are finding it really difficult. That's coupled with what we've done through neighbourhood planning. These are our local plans that have planning weight, where places such as St Ives and Padstow, which are coastal communities that have lots of second homes, we were the first place in the country through the neighbourhood plan that put a stipulation in that any new build homes had to have a primary residence for people that were living then within the community. That's great, but that's only for new builds. So this complementary change that we're seeking will enable us to with local communities, because we don't have a second home issue in some of our inland communities within Cornwall. We need it to be targeted and specific to have those powers at a local level. Hope that answers the question, Chris.
It does indeed. Thank you, Kate. I'm seeing some nodding and I can see some furious note-taking as well. So I might ask one final question. I was a bit staggered by a stat, Peter, that you gave us, a shortage in the next 15 years of 675,000 houses, I think you said. If all of these initiatives or recommendations of yours are adopted, given what we're seeing around the sector, the different things people are trying, how realistically do you think we can achieve meeting that shortage? Because it sounds massive.
Yeah, and look, just to endorse that comment, Chris, it is a big number, absolutely. And what we see in Australia is a mix of both overcrowding, so people in properties who should ideally be somewhere else, and also a lack of provision of properties that does result in that couch surfing. It could result in rough sleeping, and just another number that I have immediately to mind, but just as a bit of a contrast to what we heard earlier, the number of rough sleepers in Sydney LGA on any one night's around 300 or 350. I'm not sure of the same number off the top of my head in any of the Victorian LGAs, but I just raised that for context. And then on top of that, of course, you have challenges associated with overcrowding, etc. So the numbers are large and the challenge is large. And for Australia, in order to meet that challenge, we need to think really clearly about whether we are trying to provide houses or bedrooms. And indeed, what we have is many social housing properties under-occupied, not fit for purpose, not fully inhabited. We have an issue of a long waiting list. We have those challenges that I've mentioned before. What we really need to focus on is both the number of properties and their fit for purpose. And if we're able to break that mold that we have today of standard form housing provision, really looking to government to shoulder the bulk of that load, then we will be able to move beyond the challenge that we face. But it is a large challenge for us to face over that sort of time horizon. And I just point to some of the work of Ahuri, and particularly for local government, a paper written by Gorin in 2003 that talks to very explicitly the role of Australian local government in playing an active role in meeting these challenges. So Ahuri and Gorin, 2003, you can find those, both the organisation Ahuri and Gorin online. And of course, NIFIC, the Commonwealth agency providing low cost debt to community housing providers, including, just to say it again, local governments where they do so, is also a great research partner of ours, so I encourage you to have a look at NIFIC's work as well.
Thank you, Peter. I feel like you've given us a pep talk tonight. We've got renewed confidence in our ability to actually move the levers on this issue. Thank you for that and for your presentation tonight. Great to have you with us, Peter Colacino, Chief of Policy and Research at Infrastructure Australia. Can I also thank Brian Geaney, Assistant CEO from Cork City Council in Ireland. Thank you very much, Brian, for your presentation and your insights tonight. And to Kate Kennally, the CEO at Cornwall Council in the UK. Thank you, Kate. Terrific to hear your thoughts as well. Kathryn, can I hand it over to you to sum up?
Thank you so much, Chris, for that. And look, wow, what just a fantastic discussion. It could have gone on for so much longer. I really do thank our panelists also, but also I'd like to thank my co-host tonight, Chris Eddy, although he did most of the hosting. I won't pretend otherwise. Thank you again to Andy and our partners at LGiU. We really do look forward to hosting these quarterly global executive panels and hope to do so into next year. So looking forward to the planning that goes along with that. But I'd really like to thank you in the audience also for the time and the commitment that you've made in attending this discussion tonight. I know many of you are very busy juggling not only your councillor roles, and I acknowledge all of the elected representatives in the room, and I was remiss in not acknowledging the VLGA President, Councillor Denise Massoud, who is with us, a councillor at Whitehorse City Council, but all of the councillors and others in the room, and those who are new to VLGA Connect, welcome, and we hope to see you again. And I wish everyone a safe and happy day wherever you might be in the world. Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone who's participated in our session tonight. Thank you to our panel members, Kate Kennally, Brian Geaney and Peter Colacino. Thank you to Kathryn and the team at the VLGA, and to Andy and the team at LGiU. That's the last of our global executive panels for 2021. Thank you to you for joining us. Hope you found something of interest in our topics this year. Good night and see you again soon.